recorded. There we go. And so as we've started talking about already, Thursday night, the other shoe dropped, right? And ironically, interestingly, it was dropped by none other than Donald Trump himself, who took to his Truth social media platform and let us know that he had been indicted. His ongoing effort to shape the narrative surrounding his current legal jeopardy. And I am shamelessly borrowing from Adam Sewer in my title for today. The illegality is the point. And so as we started discussing, does this strengthen Trump's political hand? One of the things I think we need to take seriously is that this is part of a deliberate political strategy, and that from where we stand, and assuming that none of us is a big Donald Trump fan or on the Fox News diet or bought into the partisan lens that would suggest that this is a weaponization of the Department of Justice, a witch hunt, a hoax, but instead we take seriously what we have learned from the indictment that has now been unsealed and is readily available to us, that Donald Trump retained hundreds of documents illegally, that he obstructed the effort of the federal government to get those documents returned, to investigate the retention of them, and that he ultimately not only stored them in an incredibly insecure and frankly cavalier way, as documented by the image here, right, of them strewn across the floor of a bathroom, right? And those images have been redacted. Apparently there is highly classified material sitting there on the bathroom floor. That all of this amounts to a threat to our security, I think is clear. But my central claim here today is that this is not merely Trump getting caught with his hand in the cookie jar. This is a risk that he took in a calculated way. I'll speak a little bit about maybe his motivations here, but he had to anticipate, he had to assume, given all of the scrutiny focused on him, that eventually this would come to the light of day. And he also made the calculation that he could bend this to his political advantage, right? And so, well, I want to say this reveals who Donald Trump is, right? He's somebody who does not think the rules, the laws apply to him, who thinks it's a sucker's game to do what the government tells you just because it's the law and they're threatening you, who throughout his life has gotten away again and again and again in a Houdini-like fashion, escaped the legal consequences of his borderline or overtly illegal action, right? That's who he is, but it's also, and this I think is critical, part of his brand, part of his popularity, part of his political viability. And the reason that so many Americans are so loyal to him is precisely because he sticks his middle finger up at the law. And so I think we need to take seriously not only that this is who he is, but this is how he wants to be seen, right? One of the columnists for the New Yorker said that Trump is in part unique because he says the quiet part out loud, right? He doesn't on the down low reveal that he has these documents. He waits for it to blow up because he's calculated that it's to his advantage. And I don't think we should underestimate a man who has spent 7.5 decades thwarting the law. Maybe it's only 5 decades thwarting the law, and has gotten away with it repeatedly. And not only that, has wealth that measures in the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars as a result, and has been president and is the leading candidate for his party, and frankly, has a reasonable chance of being president again. We shouldn't underestimate his calculus that ultimately these revelations will redound to his advantage. And so I want to emphasize today, you know, putting classified documents in a bathroom or on a stage at a resort obviously risks the security of the United States, but prosecuting Donald Trump for doing this presents a substantially greater risk to our democracy. And so while we will talk today about the legal jeopardy that Donald Trump is in, and it's real, and I think those of us who do not like him are hungry for him to finally be legally accountable for what he has done, and hopefully to be put in jail for his clear illegality. But having said that, we also have to take seriously, we also have to really not be distracted from the gravity of the danger to our political and legal systems, because to be as clear as possible, this trial, I don't think there's any chance that it actually results in a verdict before the elections of November 2024. And so, what is ultimately really going to determine what happens to Donald Trump is the primary for the Republican Party. And if he secures the nomination of his party, the outcome of the general election. The Justice Department has a policy in place that says it will not prosecute a sitting president. We don't need another Saturday Night Massacre. We don't need Trump to fire the special investigator, Jack Smith, in this case. He can, if he wins the presidency, rely on the fact that for 4 years he will be immune from prosecution, right? And by then, I think we will be much more concerned about the damage that he will do in the Oval Office for a second 4 years. And just to be as clear as possible, I've been looking again, I return to often the really important work of Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zablat, How Democracies Die. And one of the things they point out that authoritarians do is, in order to win, the metaphor they use is the soccer match, they attack the referee. Right. And I want to be as clear as possible at the outset of this. I find the evidence presented in the indictment, which has now been unsealed, and we can see, right, an annotated version of it on the New York Times webpage. I find the evidence to be highly persuasive. The thoroughness of the investigation, the fact that they have his lawyers, his valets, so many pictures, recordings, seems to me to present a very convincing case that Donald Trump did, in fact, break the espionage law, did, in fact, obstruct justice, and that the result of this should be that he will spend years or decades in jail. But having said that, I also have to immediately confess that the fact that I think that Donald Trump has been a disaster for the United States obviously influences my judgment as to his innocence or guilt. And I don't think I can be objective in this case. So that it is important that Donald Trump have his day in court, that he be presumed innocent until proven guilty, and that his guilt has to be established according to the normal burdens of the criminal justice system in the United States. That is, that he be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and that ultimately all of us need the judicial system to play the role of actually validating our judgment in this case, or perhaps invalidating it. Perhaps the defense will be strong enough. Perhaps there will be holes in the case and he will be, in fact, vindicated. I think we have to be open to that possibility. But having said all of that, right, this is what we want the judiciary to do in a democracy, to be above the partisan fray, to be a non-political branch of our government, because our partisan loyalties and views shape our perception of reality to the point where we are sometimes incapable of being objective. And so we rely on the judicial system to be a nonpartisan institution above the fray. What Levitsky and Zablat point out in How Democracies Die is one of the key things that authoritarian or would-be authoritarian leaders do, is either to capture the judiciary, and they add, by the way, the press and other civil society organizations, the referees, the people who, when they're doing their job, are not just partisan mouthpieces, but in fact stand above the fray and help us to sort things out and be sure that our judgments, influenced as they are by partisan factors, reflect the underlying reality that we think they reveal. That if they can't capture the referees, the next best thing is to attack and undermine them. And I think one of the things we have to recognize, what Kevin McCarthy is doing, what Donald Trump is doing, what the leadership of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives is doing, is trying to assail the objectivity of the Department of Justice, and ultimately, I think, of the legal system in the United States. And they have the loyalty. They are influencing the judgment of roughly a third of Americans. And in that scenario, trying to try the former president presents a grave risk to our democracy. So that's what I want to speak with you about today. And I'm going to start with the actual content of the indictment. Now, I'm in my slides. I can't see you. I imagine many of us have comments. So please unmute yourself, put something in the chat, raise your hand whenever you want to speak. So what is Donald Trump being charged with? Well, there's 7 charges, 37 counts in the indictment. He'll have to appear to be arraigned in a federal court, as Felicity has already pointed out. The judge who has been assigned to the case, Eileen Connor, has already showed herself to have a fair bit of deference to Donald Trump, who appointed her to the bench. We will have to see how this goes, although, as I say, we're really in the very, very early stages of this whole thing, and I think we have years for it to play out and to see who the judge ultimately will be and how he or she will conduct themselves. So for now, we should just really be focusing on the indictment, and the indictment is based on an underlying fact scenario. So rather than going through all 7 charges and 37 counts, I want to focus us on what is alleged as matter of fact. And here,
David, if I may interrupt, this is Wilma.
Hi, Wilma, go ahead. Yeah. Go, please. Are you still there, Wilma? I think you may be muted again.
The objection to the judge is not just her, that she favors Trump because he appointed her, but because she's an incompetent she has no qualifications for the role she's playing, which is true of many of his appointees. And she is simply not qualified to try a case of this magnitude.
I understand what you're saying and why you're saying. It is, I think, almost impossible to disqualify a judge on the basis of incompetence in the American legal system, right? And
I agree with you on that.
yeah, and so and we'll get into this as we get a little further along. Part of the problem is, of course, the politicization of judicial appointments, right? And so the fact that somebody who appears to be incompetent, let's take that for granted for a moment, got onto the bench because of her politics, if that's accurate, would be in and of itself a fundamental problem. But having said that, she's not going to be disqualified for that reason. And I will just say very quickly, right? You know, she appointed a special master. Ultimately, that was appealed and overturned. And the panel that overturned her really slapped her on the wrist for showing undue deference to a former president, right? Under our legal system, everybody is equal under the law. It doesn't matter that you were a former president. And in her holdings, she indicated that he deserved a certain kind of special deference. Having said all of that, I think there's an argument to be made that her appointing of the special master slowed this whole thing down. And so the fact that it got slowed down makes it less likely that it will go to trial before the presidential election, which opens the door for the idea that it may never go to trial. So look, she's already done damage in this case for holdings that have ultimately been overturned on appeal. I think what I'm trying to build the groundwork for is the idea that there may be different grounds if the Justice Department wants to for trying to shift to a different judge. We don't know yet why she got assigned to the case. Was it mere lottery, which makes it kind of strange that twice she's been assigned to this case when there's a 1 in 15 odd of her being assigned on either situation. But please note, and here's, I think, something to bear in mind. Should this go to court, right? Should Judge Connor remain the judge hearing it? I think one of the things that the special counsel in the Department of Justice feels is that his case is so strong that he can risk these kinds of difficulties. Please note that the jury pool will be drawn from a county in Florida that is quite strongly pro-Trump, right? That many of us were surprised that it was the Miami or the Florida grand jury that brought the indictment as opposed to the jury impaneled in Washington, D.C. that did most of the investigation. Again, this seems to reflect the confidence of the special counsel that he can convict even with a jury and a judge that seems to be a little bit less favorable for him than in other potential venues. Having said all of that, again, I want to push our attention away from the case because the case is 2 years from now and so much more is at stake in the intervening 2 years about the health of American democracy, which really depends on political and not legal considerations. David, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, again, I hate to rely on the PBS NewsHour, but Ruth Marcus's, who may have been paid to say this, last night said that she thought that Smith assigned it intentionally to someone who was sympathetic to Trump, so that the argument that they were playing politics and assigning the case to a court couldn't be levied by the Republicans, and that and that seems to me to play out in two ways. Number one is she gonna do something that's blatantly political and risk, uh, you know, getting a lot of Americans against Trump because he is playing politics, or might she do something that a higher court, an appeals court, or even the Supreme Court would have to correct and do the right thing? So she thinks it's very intentional on the part of the Democrats and Smith to do this.
Interesting, David, because I had not heard that Ruth Marcus. I don't watch television news, even though I like the news hour and used to watch it. I just don't have time anymore. But I had exactly the same thought, and so in answering Wilma, I said we don't know yet, right? Why Eileen Connor is the judge. It could very well be that the special prosecutor requested that that this case be heard by her, and in part so Trump couldn't say it's an Obama judge, right?
Yeah. One other thing, I have one other question.
Yeah.
Why is there anything that the judiciary, that the Justice Department can do to see to it that this case gets prosecuted earlier?
I don't think so. And so there are a number of issues here, and I have to immediately say, right, I'm not a lawyer. This is not my specialty. So I may be wrong, and there's plenty that has surprised us in this so far. I may be surprised about this, but it appears to me that the case in Manhattan is ahead of this case, right, in terms of having been brought earlier, having been further along. And we already know that there's a trial date in Manhattan for March of 2024, right? And I think one of the things to note here, right, is that Trump's legal team is in disarray, that two of his main lawyers resigned, that one of his other main lawyers appears to be very difficult to work with. And so other lawyers, by the way, Donald Trump himself is incredibly difficult to work with, doesn't do what lawyers tell him to do, thinks he knows more than they do, asks them to do things that puts them in jeopardy, potentially being disbarred, as we're seeing, right, with this indictment. The allegation is that he used his lawyers to commit conspiracy to obstruct justice. And by the way, the lawyer's privilege, attorney-client privilege, has been violated because a judge agrees that Trump was using his lawyers to commit a crime, and therefore privilege does not protect their communications with him. All of that to say, he's going to be in trial March of 2024 before this trial occurs, unless something happens where Alvin Bragg in Manhattan says, I'll get out of the way, right? That's one scenario in which maybe this could go to court more quickly. But having said that, judges will have to be involved in allowing, right, Manhattan to step aside. And the thing that we know from Trump's long legal record, right, hundreds of cases, is that he instructs his lawyers to delay in every way possible, that the federal judiciary is a little bit more complex and generally more cautious in allowing the accused to actually delay things in order to secure a fair trial, to allow them sufficient time to prepare their defense, to study the complexity of the indictment and the law, etc. I don't see, based on my inexpert judgment, a scenario in which this goes to court. There's a conviction. The appeals have all played out before November of 2024. I think it's much more likely that this is going to have to await the verdict of the American people in the primary election and the general election, that this is once again more about politics in the first instance. If Trump doesn't get the nomination, if he doesn't run as a third party candidate, if he doesn't beat the Democratic candidate, then the trial will proceed. But all of that depends on the prior verdict of the American people on Donald Trump before the verdict of the jury in a court in Florida. On which note, keep the questions coming, but let me get back to where I left off. And that is talking about the underlying fact scenario here. And so the idea that Trump intentionally retained these documents in his possession, right? And I think that's extremely important, right? Both Mike Pence and Joe Biden also apparently inadvertently retained classified documents after they left office, both of them as vice president. But as soon as they discovered them, they called them to the attention of the Department of Justice, the FBI, the National Archive, and relinquished them. It appears that Donald Trump didn't just accidentally retain a few documents, but that he purposely maintained possession and resisted the effort of the government to get these documents back, that many of these documents were highly sensitive and classified and would be damaging to national security if their security was jeopardized, if they were seen by the wrong eyes or fell into the wrong hands. So that's element number one of the fact scenario. Element number two, that Trump was incredibly cavalier in his handling and treatment of these documents, that he deliberately shared them with persons lacking security clearance and left them in unsecure spaces in his resorts, especially Mar-a-Lago in Florida, where tens of thousands of persons were in close proximity and may have been able to access these documents. And so one aspect of this, which I am completely speculating about right now, is whether or not, in fact, the Chinese or the Russians or the North Koreans or the Iranians got their hands or their cameras on any of these documents. And so it's been known for quite a while that these documents were at Mar-a-Lago, that Mar-a-Lago is a place where weddings and parties and graduations occur, that private individuals rent it out and invite their guests. How hard would it have been for a representative of one of those governments to get themselves invited to one of those events and then to snoop around? I think it needs to be investigated. And here I want to say a picture is worth 1,000 words. These are some of the pictures from the indictment. It's a peculiar indictment. Clearly, it's meant to function as not just a legal, but also a public document. Clearly, the special counsel recognizes what I'm trying to argue today, which is that ultimately, probably the court of public opinion is the prior and in many ways decisive court. If Trump is elected, he can't be prosecuted. And so the prosecutor needs to convince the public not to elect Donald Trump, making these pictures public of how they're just crammed into spaces, including on a stage, in a ballroom, in a bathroom, in a storage facility with just a little lock on it that would be easily picked, in a bathroom where they're strewn across the floor. This is designed to influence public opinion. And here the critical question is, how many members of the public say that's a bridge too far? We value our security. We recognize that our state collects this information and shares it with the president in order to protect us and to enhance our security. We have been attacked by terrorists. We have rivals in the world. And the jeopardizing, the cavalier attitude that it reveals, the indifference to the security of the United States that this betrays, means that some of the supporters of Donald Trump need to take a second look at it. And I want to be as clear as possible, right? How are the supporters of Donald Trump going to be influenced by this information? I don't think it's going to be because they read the annotated indictment on the New York Times website. It's going to have to be Chris Christie. It's going to have to be Ron DeSantis. It's going to have to be one of the figures on Fox News trying to say as loudly and clearly to the Republican base, you should care about this. And then, right, there's the counter argument. And this is, I think, right, not about the law. It is about the fact scenario, but it is also about whether or not you trust the US government, whether or not you want the US government's secrets to be maintained, or whether you think that Donald Trump is treating the secure, secret, classified documents with exactly the respect they deserve by throwing them across a bathroom floor, and you double down on your support for him as a result, whether or not you believe him when he says, right, I stand up for you, the people who have been screwed by this government for generations. And the only reason I'm being persecuted and prosecuted is because I stand up for you. He has established that narrative from the very beginning of his presidency. Even when he was president of the United States, he railed against the deep state, against the very people he had appointed to run his administrative agencies, and suggested to his followers that the government was tilted against him because he was in favor of his followers' interests. And so this is a potent and well-developed narrative that Donald Trump has mastered, has had in place for many years. And I think this is part of the reason why people like David Brooks are saying, you know, this actually favors him. It lets him remain at the center of our media sphere. It lets all of the public attention go to him, and it lets him continue to play the card of grievance, of persecution, of vindication that he has played to such effect in our national politics for such a long time. All right, sorry. Third aspect of the fact scenario, that Trump resisted and obstructed efforts to have him voluntarily return these documents. And I'm not going to go through the whole timeline, but you probably know already that the efforts to retrieve these documents began soon after Trump left the White House with these hundreds of boxes in tow, that the government initially asked politely and nicely for the National Archive to be able to retrieve them. When that didn't work, and right, they then issued a subpoena. Donald Trump appears to have played a cat and mouse game, moving these documents around to trick his own lawyers into believing that he had actually surrendered all of them. He appears to have displayed them publicly to people with no security clearance, acknowledging that they were classified. He appears to have induced his lawyers to lie on his behalf, right? And so all of this amounts then to a conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, to deceive federal agents about the retention of documents. And when you put together the first aspect, which is a violation of the Espionage Act with the third aspect, which is a conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation. We are now talking about charges that, if Trump is convicted, would put him in jail, presumably for decades. And when you add to that the second and third element, that he was reckless in his handling of these documents, and that he obstructed not only efforts to have them retrieved, but efforts to determine whether or not they were in his possession, I can't imagine a judge, even Judge Eileen Connor, being lenient with Trump. So the legal jeopardy here is real. Do the facts fit the law? And again, this is premature, right? We will have to see the defense that Donald Trump mounts. But from my admittedly biased and hostile perspective, I see overwhelming evidence that the fact scenario that I just shared with you amounts to clear violations of the law that don't have compelling defenses available. And so the likelihood is that if this goes to court, Trump will be convicted and jailed. Having said all of that, let us then focus on the fact that the primary question is political, not legal. The primary question is, how will this play out in the court of public opinion? And there, I think the answer is quite clearly ambivalent, that this will continue to peel away from Donald Trump some of the mainstream Republicans who really do care about national security issues, that the indictment already does some of the work that I'm sure the political advertisements are really going to hit hard on, which is that Donald Trump ran in 2016 against Hillary Clinton using her handling of sensitive and classified information as a cudgel with which to beat her, in light of the insecure server that she used for email when she was Secretary of State. So on the one hand, right, Donald Trump's own words are going to be used against him, and I think that is likely to diminish his standing with some mainstream Republicans who really do care about national security. And on the other hand, this is likely to further the motivation and mobilization of his core supporters. So let's spend a little bit of time looking at this, and let me first go to this, because in a sense, and it saddens me, I don't think it is a happy day for America when a former president is being charged with grotesque violations of the law. And the question is not, as it was with Richard Nixon, right, whether his party will choose the Constitution and the law or loyalty to the individual politician. As Barry Goldwater said to Nixon, the answer is clear. We choose the Constitution and the law. You have to resign, or else you will be impeached. I will just add very quickly, had Donald Trump been convicted in the two separate impeachment trials that he faced, right, had in particular Mitch McConnell not orchestrated his and please note, right, that Donald Trump is presenting this in his initial reaction to the indictment as vindication, as a demonstration that the system is stacked against him, but when it actually comes to the trial, he isn't convicted, he's vindicated. Had, right, the Senate convicted Donald Trump, either, right, for trying to force the Ukraine to produce false evidence against Joe Biden, or for motivating the attack on the Capitol in order to disrupt the registering of the Electoral College vote, we wouldn't be in this jeopardy right now. So our political process has already failed us, and now we're shifting attention to the legal process, but we have to go back to the political process. Here, then, unfortunately, is where we have to start our analysis. What will this indictment do to Donald Trump's prospects for gaining the nomination of his party and perhaps eventually to the presidency, right? And first of all, please note, right, Donald Trump was indicted in Manhattan in March, and right at that point, his favorability rating was in the mid 40s. Now it's in the mid 50s, right? So he has benefited from that indictment, or at least he hasn't been damaged. But I think it's more likely the second, that what the indictment does is it puts him back in the spotlight, and it feeds his narrative that the system is rigged against him and against him because he stands up for other people that the system is rigged against. At the time that the indictment was announced, Ron DeSantis of Florida was within striking distance of Donald Trump. Please note that the gap between them has about doubled in the intervening months. And so one question is this just what happens when Trump is indicted and the content of the indictment doesn't matter at all? Or does the depravity of the conduct, and here I think that's a fair description of taking classified material, refusing to return it to the government, holding it up as trophies to show to reporters and aides, strewing it across a bathroom floor that is totally insecure. This is depraved conduct, right? Is public opinion sensitive to the content of the conduct, right? Providing hush money for a porn star to stay quiet about an affair that occurred long before he was a candidate is of a different kind, a different order, qualitatively distinct from what we're talking about here, which is an abuse of his office, taking these documents after he's no longer president, and a wanton disregard for the security of the United States. Will public opinion react differently? I don't know. I am hopeful that at least a portion of it will, and that the likes of Chris Christie, who clearly carries a grudge against Donald Trump, and who is such a long shot that he seems to have very little to lose by making this central to his campaign, who is going to be in a town hall on CNN Monday night, right? That he may be able to penetrate the predetermined partisan loyalty of at least members of the Trump base, and that this may shift the dynamics in our politics. But let us not forget that this is not all about Donald Trump, right? That this is part of the advantage for him. He's very masterful at sucking all of the attention, but it is also about who he runs against. And of course, that is likely to be Joe Biden. And as we can see, right, Joe Biden has very low approval rating. And oddly, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not quite sure why this is the case. It appears to be getting lower, despite the fact, right, that we avoided the debt crisis, that many of his policies seem to be succeeding. Something I want to talk with you about later, but it appears that the troika of the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS bill, and the infrastructure bill have created 800,000 new jobs in the last year, right? That there's stuff that Biden should perhaps be getting credit for, but he's not in opinions, right? When we look at them head to head, right? The majority of Americans believe, I shouldn't say the majority, but Biden does better in terms of being honest and trustworthy. And presumably this will continue to shift in his favor, but Trump does better in terms of having the mental sharpness to serve effectively as president, right? And note that's almost 2-1. And being in good enough physical health to serve effectively as president, it is really 2-1, right? And so when you ask Democrats, do they want Biden to be the nominee, right? The majority say no, nominate someone else, right? And this is true for Democrats, Democratic leaning adults, and independents who lean Democratic. And so all of that to say that it seems to me, right, that this needs to be a two-way comparison, and that again, there's an opportunity for Donald Trump to use this to increase his competitiveness in the primaries and then in the general election. It is a double-edged sword, and we have to hope that public opinion, that there are enough moderate mainstream Republicans who say this is a bridge too far. I cannot vote for this man in light of this conduct, but that is a right judgment that depends in part not only on who Donald Trump is and how he's revealed himself via his action, but also on who his rival is. And that the polling data on 2016 suggests that a lot of Republicans did not like Donald Trump, but they disliked Hillary Clinton more. The advantage that Joe Biden has is he doesn't tend to produce that level of negativity. But on the other hand, Donald Trump's effort to say, look at how unfair Biden is being to me. Look at how he is using the Justice Department to go after me rather than facing me man to man in a fair election, may succeed in further dragging Biden's approval rating down and perhaps diminishing his trustworthiness. So very quickly, I will just mention, right, this is not the end of Donald Trump's legal troubles. His legal team is in disarray. He's facing 2 trials. He is potentially facing a 3rd federal indictment for what was done to overturn the federal elections, whether that's storming Congress or presenting false elector slates, pressuring Pence to overturn the results of the Electoral College, disseminating false information about the election, lots of legal jeopardy there. And then, of course, there's the investigation in Florida as well. So all of that to say, if this is an ordinary legal scenario, there's tremendous jeopardy facing Donald Trump, but it's not an ordinary legal scenario. I am happy to take questions. I do have more information I could share with you, plenty of it. And if nobody has a question at this juncture, I'll just say a few more things. First, that it's very clear, despite everything I've just said, and what I've just said is prosecuting Trump presents a grave risk for American democracy. And please note what this says about Donald Trump, right? He, at some level, must appreciate the threat that this poses to the rule of law and the judicial system and American constitutional democracy, and he doesn't care, right? So having said all of that, is this a reason not to prosecute him? And I want to say doubly no. On the one hand, if the evidence is as clear and as voluminous as it appears to be, the Department of Justice has no choice, right? You have to prosecute somebody who is a brazen law breaker, right? And especially if that person is president of the United States or was a former president, is a billionaire or a multi-hundred millionaire, you have to go after them to uphold the principle of equality under the law, the principle of accountability of elected officials for not abusing their office, and the principle of protecting the democratic process from being manipulated through disinformation and distortion, right? So I think all of that speaks to our need to prosecute him, but I do think we have to be careful in thinking that prosecution will accomplish the goal of doing more than vindicating those principles, or maybe even vindicating those principles, because the American legal system is increasingly perceived to be not a referee above the fray, but a partisan institution doing the bidding of the people currently in power, and because Donald Trump will do everything in his power to make sure that his supporters view the legal and judicial system in that way. So the impediments to the legal system passing the test, right? We've got a former president and leading presidential candidate mobilizing, leading the charge against the legal system, right? This is crossing the Rubicon. Never has a presidential candidate or a president been charged in this way, and charged by his successor, who will be facing him in an election in a matter of 18 months, right? It's a political trial in a hyper-partisan environment, right, in which the Republican Party has increasingly turned against democratic norms like the rule of law, equality before the law, the idea that you respect the outcomes of the election, even if it doesn't go your way. It also occurs at a moment of epistemic anarchy. And here, right, the fact that Fox News is going to shape the opinion of a large swath of the American public, that a substantial number of people get their news primarily from social media. Social media is governed by algorithms that present you only with the news that keeps your eyes on the screen, and that tends to be the news that you want to see, right? That all of this is going to make it hard to establish truth. And of course, right, President Trump and the media meet each other halfway in denying the epistemic standing of those with whom they disagree. It's all a hoax. It's all made up. It's all a conspiracy. It's all the deep state. It's all persecution. There's no underlying commitment to principles or establishing truth. We also live in a moment of what I've called algorithmically amplified affect. I think the Surgeon General's recent report really helps us to understand that these devices that we spend so much time with make us angry, make us anxious, amplify our worst emotions, our envy, our mistrust, our hatred, and that this is showing up and being channeled into partisan animosity. And finally, this is a trial that occurs at a moment of deep mistrust by many Americans of many institutions. I just spent a lot of time talking about why that mistrust has been earned by the government, by its failure to establish a fair and decent political economy that supports democracy and gives fair life chances to most Americans. That, right, is earned mistrust, but it's also at this point quite generalized, right? And there are aspects in which we could talk more about this. The judiciary has been very much part of this. This is why I spent some time speaking with you about the code of capital, the way in which the areas of contract and tax and bankruptcy and trust law have been instrumentalized to allow assets to be shielded and used in new ways to generate profit. The judicial system is part of the problem, but that doesn't mean that it is wholly corrupt. But many of us are not making those fine distinctions. So all of that to say, this is fundamentally a political problem, and we're going to have to solve it in the public sphere via elections, via debate. We're going to have to hope that the Republican Party can break the hypnotic spell that Donald Trump has cast on so many members of its public. Because if it doesn't, if people don't come to their senses, if we can't convince them, look, this shows us who Donald Trump is, and he's dangerous to the security of our society and to the health of our democracy, then he may very well skate away from this indictment, as he has done so many times in his past. How's that for a nice note to conclude on? But I think we need to be honest with ourselves about the fact that although so many of us have been hoping Donald Trump would finally face the music for his clear illegality, it's not that simple or straightforward. Politics comes first. All right, Flossie, I see you. Go ahead, but you got to unmute, remember. I don't know if you're speaking, Flossie. I can't hear you. You got to hold that space bar down or that microphone icon. There you go. Yes, go ahead.
Obviously, he is insane. What we are faced with is insanity and another group surrounding him, but he is insane. What do we do with a person who is out of control? Don't we have to put him into a straitjacket? Don't we have to give him a shot? Doesn't the word treason mean anything anymore? Language is going out the window too. I think there has to be some show of restraint. It's too crazy to go on.
So crazy like a fox,
yes,
right? Because what he has done has succeeded beyond really, I think, anybody's thought about how he might. And so let's just be as clear as possible. From where you and I stand, this man is a deranged narcissist who presents a threat to our country. By the way, members of his own family who are trained as psychologists have written whole books trying to demonstrate this. But neither you nor I is a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and neither you nor I have had the kind of access required to actually diagnose him as a patient. And so we have to recognize that we are not going to march off to Mar-a-Lago or Bedminster or wherever he is with a straitjacket and penetrate the Secret Service protection that he has and put him in the institution we think he deserves to be in. And that part of the value of living in the kind of society we live in is that that doesn't happen to people unless they end up right in the psychiatric hospital to begin with. That's not going to happen to Donald Trump. So as opposed to simply wishing that he gets locked up and treated with whatever would perhaps restore his sanity, we have to fight this fight in the way that we do in a democracy with the rule of law. We have to try to convince the people who support him that it is not good for the country to support him. And so we have to, in a sense, try to say to them, not that this man is insane. I think that's a non-starter. Instead, look, you've tried for 6 years following this path. We acknowledge that your anger and grievance is legitimate and that this system has not worked for you for a long time. Will you please acknowledge that voting for Donald Trump is not the way to fix it, but actually puts us in danger? And then we can start to work together to figure out what we need to do to fix the system. And maybe we need to also acknowledge that the Democrats bear some of the responsibility for creating the situation that has given rise to so much grievance. And by the way, if your grievance is about the fact that we got a Black president or a biracial vice president, or the fact that we're becoming increasingly diverse and that our laws allow migration, I'm sorry, but that is a misdiagnosis of the situation. And we have to have that conversation too, right? If your grievance is about the fact that more and more people are openly gay or transitioning their gender identity, that's not the correct diagnosis of why the country has become worse for so many people. We need to have that conversation as well. So I just think that calling the leader of one of the main two parties insane, while it may satisfy us, doesn't actually advance our interests or help to begin to repair democracy. Sorry, Flossie, for being so direct and pushing back on you, but I want to be as clear as possible, right? You and I see this from one vantage. Our vantage does not dictate the truth or influence directly the way many other people see him. Let's see, Anne, go ahead, and then I'll come to you, David.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about this person that may be nominated, maybe even win an election. People need to remember that Hitler was voted into power.
After being put on trial and convicted, and
Yeah.
after using that trial to increase his visibility. No, I thought exactly in these terms
Yeah.
when I was preparing today's lecture, which is that for most of us, the worst possible thing in the world is to be caught violating the law and put on trial. For a certain kind of populist leader who wants to undermine the judiciary, who wants to run against the system, who wants to claim the whole thing is rigged, and that their willingness to violate the law demonstrates that they are really on your side. This is an advantage, right? And so again, I think this can be a case of both and. It's an advantage for Trump with his core constituency, and it may actually hinder him winning a national election because it will repel other people who might otherwise vote for him. But it's always a comparison. And that means Joe Biden has to do well enough to convince people to stick with him if he is the alternative to Donald Trump. David, go ahead. Or Anne, were you done?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, David.
Here we go. Yeah. After listening to today's discussion, I'm concluded that pursuing the legal route isn't going to do us much good politically. It sounds to me like the more we push that button and that narrative, the more Trump supporters increase their loyalty to him. And I just think the problem is with the Democrats, and that Democrats can't provide a convincing alternative narrative. And I'm not sure what that narrative is. You hinted at a couple of parts of it. One is we feel your pain and are willing to do something about it. But I think it's something like, has two parts, one of which is creating a story that invites other people under the umbrella of America and ensures that everyone has access to the good stuff It's not a zero-sum game. I think a lot of people believe, a lot of poor whites in particular, that the only way that they can get ahead is if someone else gets alternatively oppressed and disadvantaged. And so that has to go away. The other thing is, I think the Democrats are making a mistake in hiding Joe Biden from public presentations. I think the feeling is that the less he's on the news and the less he gets asked questions, the better off we are, because he will appear to be awkward or not immediately responsive. But I think they underestimate the degree to which that can be turned to an advantage in terms of, I'm just a working bloke from Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I've been there too, and let him loose a little bit. I just think that's a strategic error on the part of the Democrats to hide Biden as a way of preserving his whatever advantage he might have. So I think the Democrats need a different narrative and a different strategy for convincing at least the independents that they stand to gain by being a part of the broader consensus of who benefits from being an American.
Yeah, thank you, David. And I completely agree with what I think the gist of what you're saying is, which is that the threat that Donald Trump represents to our democracy cannot be addressed, cannot be exercised or treated by legal means alone. It has to be political, right? And so having said that, I also want to be as clear as possible. I don't think that's a reason to not prosecute him, right? Because
no,
he
right.
violated the law. He did it with such craven disregard that we have no choice but to go after him, right? But having said that, we have to not think that that's going to solve the political problem. That may actually worsen the political problem, even though it's our legal duty to prosecute him, right? So getting that straight. And then I'll just amplify for a moment what you said about some people thinking that they need to oppress others in order to come out from under oppression. I want to start with the idea, and Arlie Hochschild's work is very good on this, though it's not her alone, as strangers in their own land, that part of the problem is that part of the narrative that the Republican Party has very successfully managed to impose on the last 50 years of American political history is that the reason so many white working class Americans have become precarious, vulnerable, desperate is because the government has favored the interests of others like African Americans, immigrants, women, gays, transsexuals, right? And look, it turns out we have a cognitive bias. We much prefer having somebody to point the finger at and blame a scapegoat, right? If you compare an explanation that says it's about impersonal forces, it's about globalization, it's about automation, it's about the tax code, right? Then people are going to not be very satisfied with that explanation if they've got an alternative explanation that says, no, it's those guys standing right over there, they did it to you, right? And it's those damn liberals who put them in line in front of you, right? And so again, we're going to have to fight that fight as well. The appropriate explanation for what has happened to you is not that affirmative action took your opportunity away. It's that structural changes in our economy and our state have undermined your economic viability. And that's where we need to actually work on fixing things. I do think that some of the policies that Biden and the Democrats passed in their first 2 years are actually effective in addressing some of this. They don't go far enough, but here's the other thing. How do the Democrats take credit for it? Because frankly, we're in a world where hope and anger are competing against each other, right? Where Biden is not very good at articulating the hope, but it is frankly just a hard card to play well politically when the other guy is saying, I'll tell you who to blame and I'll get him for you, right? Having said all of that, I do also have to acknowledge, and I'm not following this maybe in the way I should. I read and I don't watch enough TV, but when I watched Biden, right, when he gives his Oval Office address about the debt ceiling deal and averting a crisis, I don't see a deeply convincing politician. And so, yes, you know, there's this observation by Ezra Klein that journalists tend to really want highly articulate, charismatic presidents because they're in the wordsmith game. They like articulate people. Maybe you're right. Maybe the ordinary bloke from Scroton, from I'm sorry, where Stratton, and there, I'll be inarticulate too. And the old guy who's not a danger, right? Who gets things done through dedication and perseverance and compromise. Maybe he really needs to work on that political brand because it worked for him 2.5 years ago, but he's got to get it sharp enough that it works for him 1.5 years from now. Jeanette, go ahead.
I was interested, and I don't remember whether it was Marcus or Brooks who said this, but one of them mentioned that many military people are in the GOP and that they understand the secrets and need for classification and so on, and that this may be convincing to them in a way that some other things wouldn't be.
Yeah, and that goes back to the mainstream Republican, right? So the Republican Party is split right now between populists, anti-establishment, and mainstream pro-business, pro-security. This, I think, does, and it's why I say the pictures are worth a 1,000 words, right? You know, this so clearly demonstrates that this man is a risk to national security. And so, yes, I do think it will peel away some of those voters. It's just, we got to bear in mind, it's double-edged. All right, everybody, we've gone on for quite a while. I need to keep the recording short enough that I can actually get it to the other people who haven't been able to be here today. We have plenty to talk about, and I'm sure we will continue talking about this. There was a really important Supreme Court decision which upheld Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is going to have implications not only for Alabama, but for Georgia and Texas, maybe Mississippi as well, that might actually give the Democrats a fighting chance to retake the House in 2024. There was an awful airborne toxic event in the East Coast of the United States. It's not clear it's over yet, but this seems to be an indication of things to come. People in Northern California don't need a reminder that forest fires don't just burn down forests, they also pollute the air and potentially damage our health. There's a unfolding offensive in the Ukraine. So we will have plenty to talk about in weeks to come. Look forward to being back with you next Saturday. Take care of yourselves. See everybody in a week. Thank you so much. Bye, guys.
Bye.